For nearly 3 decades, glyphosate was treated as the closest thing agriculture had to a miracle. Farmers across the United States were told a simple story. Spray once. Kill everything green. Plant into clean soil. Repeat every season. And for a long time, that story looked true. In the mid-1990s, when glyphosate-tolerant crops were introduced, the technology transformed how farms operated almost overnight. Before that moment, weed control was complicated, mechanical, and often unpredictable. Farmers rotated multiple herbicides, cultivated fields mechanically, and still lost yield to aggressive weeds. Then Roundup-ready systems arrived. Suddenly, weed management became simple. Plant glyphosate-tolerant soybeans. Spray glyphosate across the entire field. Watch every weed die. No crop injury. No complicated tank mixes. No guessing. It was clean, efficient, scalable, and in agriculture, scalability changes everything. Large farms could now manage thousands of acres with fewer passes, fewer chemicals, and fewer headaches. Equipment costs dropped. Labor needs decreased. Timing windows widened. For the first time in modern agriculture, weed control felt almost automatic. Glyphosate became the backbone of modern crop production. By the early 2000s, it was everywhere. Corn, soybeans, cotton, canola. Farmers sprayed it before planting, after planting, sometimes multiple times per season. Dealers recommended it. Agronomists supported it. Chemical companies marketed it as the safest and most reliable herbicide ever developed. And for a while, they weren't exactly wrong. Glyphosate worked incredibly well. The molecule targets a specific enzyme in plants called EPSPS, which is essential for producing amino acids that plants need to survive. When glyphosate blocks that enzyme, the plant slowly starves. No amino acids, no growth, no survival. The process is effective, systemic, and relatively slow compared to contact herbicides. That slow action allowed glyphosate to move throughout the entire plant, killing roots, stems, and leaves. Which meant weeds didn't come back. For farmers used to fighting weeds every few weeks, this was revolutionary. Fields stayed clean longer. Spray programs became simpler. Profit margins improved. Glyphosate quickly became the most widely used herbicide in human history. But here's the part nobody talked about in the early days. Nature adapts. Always. When a single control method is used repeatedly across millions of acres, the weeds that survive become the weeds that dominate the future. This isn't ideology. It's basic evolutionary biology. Inside every population of weeds, there are small genetic variations. Most plants die when sprayed with glyphosate, but occasionally one individual survives due to a mutation in the target enzyme or because it metabolizes the herbicide differently. At first, those survivors are rare. Maybe one plant in a million. So farmers don't notice. The field still looks clean. The yield still looks good. The herbicide still appears to work perfectly. But that single survivor produces seeds. Thousands of them. And those seeds carry the resistance trait. The next season, a few more resistant plants appear. Then a few more. Then suddenly the farmer starts noticing patches of weeds that don't die after spraying. The first reaction is almost always the same. Maybe I sprayed too late. Or, maybe the weather interfered. Or the classic explanation, the herbicide batch must be weak. So the farmer sprays again. Sometimes with a higher rate. Sometimes with an additional pass. Sometimes with a second herbicide mixed in. And the weeds still survive. What looked like a perfect system begins to crack. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Across the American Corn Belt, reports of glyphosate-resistant weeds began appearing in the early 2000s. At first, it seemed like a local problem. A few scattered cases. Nothing serious. But resistance behaves like a wildfire. Once it starts spreading, it rarely stays contained. Waterhemp populations in Illinois and Iowa began surviving glyphosate applications that had worked for years. Palmer amaranth exploded across southern states, growing faster than farmers could control it. Giant ragweed began shrugging off herbicide programs that once wiped it out effortlessly. Each year, more counties reported resistance. More fields lost control. More farmers started asking the same uncomfortable question. What happens when the one tool we depend on stops working? Because glyphosate wasn't just another herbicide anymore. It had become the foundation of entire farming systems. Equipment schedules were built around it. Crop rotations assumed it would work. Budgets assumed it would remain cheap. Management plans assumed weeds would always die. But agriculture has a brutal rule. Any system that relies on a single solution eventually breaks. And glyphosate was never designed to carry the entire burden of weed control for millions of acres. Yet that's exactly what happened. Year after year, spray after spray, season after season, and now the consequences are starting to show. Across the Corn Belt, farmers are discovering something that was never part of the original sales pitch. Glyphosate didn't eliminate the weed problem. It delayed it, and the weeds that are emerging now are stronger, more aggressive, and far more expensive to control than the ones that came before. The era of simple weed control is ending, and the next generation of weed management will demand something agriculture hasn't needed in a long time. Strategy. Because the weeds are no longer playing by the old rules, and the fields that ignore that reality are about to learn a very expensive lesson. When farmers first started seeing weeds survive glyphosate applications, the early explanations were comforting. Bad spray timing, rainfall dilution, incorrect rates. Those explanations allowed the industry to treat resistance as a management mistake rather than a structural problem. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Farmers were spraying correctly, rates were correct, weather conditions were ideal, and the weeds still survived. That's when researchers started looking deeper, not at the spray program, but at the biology of the weeds themselves. What they discovered was not a temporary problem. It was evolution happening in real time across millions of acres. To understand what happened, we need to go back to how glyphosate actually works inside a plant. Glyphosate targets a biochemical pathway known as the shikimate pathway, which plants use to produce essential amino acids. These amino acids are the building blocks required for growth, cell repair, and reproduction. Inside that pathway sits an enzyme called EPSPS. That enzyme is the lock. Glyphosate is the key that jams it. When glyphosate binds to the EPSPS enzyme, the plant can no longer produce critical amino acids. Without those amino acids, protein production stops. Growth stops. Eventually, the plant dies. For years, scientists believed resistance to glyphosate would be unlikely because the mechanism was so specific. The assumption was simple. If a mutation changed the EPSPS enzyme enough to block glyphosate, it would also damage the plant's ability to function. In theory, resistant plants would be weaker. In reality, evolution found several ways around the problem, and weeds are exceptionally good at exploiting tiny biological loopholes. Researchers eventually discovered 4 major resistance mechanisms developing in weed populations across North America. The first mechanism is the most straightforward. A mutation changes the EPSPS enzyme just enough that glyphosate can no longer bind effectively. The enzyme still functions for the plant, but the herbicide loses its grip. Think of it like changing the shape of a lock so the old key no longer fits. The plant survives. The herbicide fails. The second resistance mechanism is even more aggressive. Instead of modifying the enzyme, the plant simply produces more of it. Some resistant waterhemp populations have been found carrying dozens of copies of the EPSPS gene. That means the plant produces far more target enzyme than normal. Glyphosate still binds to some enzymes, but there are so many copies that the plant continues producing amino acids anyway. It's biological overproduction. Spray all you want. The plant simply overwhelms the herbicide with sheer enzyme volume. The third mechanism is metabolic resistance. Some weeds have evolved the ability to break down glyphosate molecules before they reach their target. In other words, the plant detoxifies the herbicide before it can do damage. That turns a lethal compound into a temporary inconvenience. The fourth mechanism is reduced herbicide movement inside the plant. Normally, glyphosate travels through the plant's vascular system, reaching roots and growing points. Certain resistant weeds slow or block that movement. The herbicide enters the leaf but never reaches the parts of the plant where it needs to act. Again, the plant survives. Now here's where things get interesting, and a little terrifying if you manage thousands of acres. These resistance mechanisms can stack. A weed population may have 2 or even 3 of these defenses operating simultaneously. Which means simply increasing the herbicide rate doesn't solve the problem. In fact, increasing rates often accelerates resistance by applying stronger selection pressure on the population. And that brings us to the real engine behind superweed evolution: selection pressure. Every time a field is sprayed with the same herbicide, susceptible plants die. Resistant plants survive. Those survivors produce seeds. Over time, the proportion of resistant plants increases. Year after year, season after season, until eventually the resistant plants dominate the field. Glyphosate didn't create the mutation. The mutation already existed. What glyphosate did was select for it. Imagine a field containing 10 million weeds. Even if only one plant carries a resistance mutation, that one plant becomes the ancestor of an entirely new population. And weeds reproduce with frightening efficiency. A single Palmer amaranth plant can produce 500,000 seeds. 500,000 potential new weeds from one survivor. Now multiply that by multiple seasons. Multiply that by multiple fields. Multiply that by multiple states. Resistance spreads quickly because seeds move. They move through combines. They move through wind. They move through irrigation water. They move on trucks, tires, and equipment. Farmers unknowingly transport resistant weeds across counties and even across state lines. Within a decade, resistance that once appeared isolated becomes regional. Within 2 decades, it becomes national. And once resistance is established, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Because those resistant seeds don't disappear. They sit in the soil seed bank, waiting. Some weed seeds remain viable for years, sometimes decades. That means the resistant genetics remain present in the field even if herbicide programs change later. Which leads to a painful reality many farmers are now discovering. Glyphosate resistance is not a temporary setback. It's a permanent shift in the weed ecosystem. And the weeds that have adapted to glyphosate are not small, weak plants struggling to survive. They are some of the most aggressive competitors in modern agriculture. Waterhemp grows fast. Palmer amaranth grows even faster. Giant ragweed can tower above crops. These weeds steal sunlight, nutrients, and moisture from crops that farmers spent thousands of dollars planting. Yield losses can reach 30% or more in severe infestations. That's not just a weed problem. That's a financial problem, because when a weed evolves resistance, the cost of controlling it multiplies. More herbicides, more passes, more labor, more complexity, and the system that once looked beautifully simple suddenly becomes expensive again. The miracle herbicide that promised effortless weed control created something agriculture had never seen before. A generation of weeds trained to survive it. And in the next part, we're going to look at the weeds that are currently causing the most damage across the Corn Belt. Because if you think resistance is just a small patch in a field somewhere, you're about to discover how widespread the problem has already become. When glyphosate resistance first appeared, it seemed manageable. A few scattered fields, some isolated populations, nothing that couldn't be handled with a stronger spray program. But resistance doesn't stay small for long. Once a weed population evolves survival mechanisms, it begins expanding across farms, counties, and entire production regions. Equipment spreads seeds. Wind spreads seeds. Combines carry them from field to field like unintentional delivery trucks. Within 2 decades, a handful of species transformed from ordinary weeds into some of the most aggressive crop competitors in North America. Today, several resistant species dominate the conversation among agronomists across the Corn Belt. These weeds aren't just annoying. They are yield thieves, profit killers, and they are forcing farmers to rethink weed control systems that once seemed permanent. Let's look at the worst offenders. 1. Waterhemp, the silent invader. Waterhemp has become one of the most notorious weeds in modern row crop agriculture. At first glance, it doesn't look particularly intimidating. The plant is slender, narrow-leaved, and easy to overlook when it's small. That's exactly why it spreads so effectively. Water hemp emerges in waves throughout the growing season. Early emerging weeds may be controlled, but later flushes appear after herbicide activity has already faded. By the time farmers notice them, they're already established. Glyphosate-resistant water hemp populations were first documented in the early 2000s, particularly across Illinois and Iowa. Today the species has spread across much of the Midwest. What makes water hemp dangerous isn't just resistance to glyphosate. Many populations are resistant to multiple herbicide modes of action. Some populations resist glyphosate, ALS inhibitors, PPO inhibitors, HPPD inhibitors. That means herbicide options shrink rapidly. In practical terms, a farmer may spray a tank mix that once killed everything, only to watch water hemp keep growing as if nothing happened. And water hemp produces enormous numbers of seeds. A single plant can generate 250,000 seeds, which means missing just a handful of survivors can turn into thousands of new weeds the following season. 2. Palmer amaranth, the aggressive competitor. If water hemp is subtle, Palmer amaranth is the opposite. This weed grows aggressively, rapidly, and relentlessly. In ideal conditions, Palmer amaranth can grow 2 to 3 inches per day. That growth rate means a weed that escapes early herbicide programs can quickly tower above crop canopies, capturing sunlight and starving crops beneath it. Palmer amaranth has already devastated cotton production systems in parts of the southern United States, forcing some farmers to abandon heavily infested fields. Now it is expanding northward. Glyphosate-resistant Palmer populations spread across states like Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, and Kansas before pushing further into the Midwest. Once Palmer establishes itself in a field, management becomes extremely difficult. The plant produces enormous biomass and massive seed output. One Palmer plant can produce 500,000 seeds in a single season. 500,000. That level of reproduction means small mistakes in weed control quickly escalate into serious infestations. 3. Giant ragweed, the yield destroyer. Giant ragweed is exactly what the name suggests. It grows tall, thick, and fast. Some plants exceed 10 feet in height, easily towering above soybean or corn canopies. That size gives ragweed a massive competitive advantage. It shades crops. It steals nutrients. It consumes water. And when resistant populations emerge, yield losses can be severe. Glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed populations began appearing in the Midwest during the early 2000s. Farmers quickly noticed something strange. Plants that once died reliably after spraying were suddenly surviving. Repeated applications failed. Tank mixes failed. In some fields, ragweed began dominating entire sections of farmland. Because ragweed emerges early in the season, missing it during initial herbicide applications can create massive competition during critical crop growth stages. Even small populations can significantly reduce yield potential. 4. Horseweed, mare's tail, the wind traveler. Horseweed is a different kind of problem. While Palmer and water hemp rely heavily on seed production within fields, horseweed spreads easily through wind dispersal. Each plant produces seeds equipped with tiny parachute-like structures. Those seeds travel miles on air currents, which means a resistant population in one field can quickly spread across an entire region. Glyphosate-resistant horseweed was one of the earliest resistant weeds documented in North America. By the mid-2000s, resistant populations had spread across large portions of the eastern United States. Horseweed thrives particularly well in no-till systems, where seeds remain near the soil surface. That connection created a difficult challenge. No-till farming delivers major soil health benefits, but it also provides favorable conditions for certain weeds. Farmers now have to balance conservation practices with increasingly complex weed control strategies. 5. Cachea, the survivor. Cachea thrives in dry environments and often dominates western agricultural regions. Unlike many weeds that stay rooted in one place, mature cachea plants can break off at the stem and tumble across fields in the wind. As they roll, they scatter thousands of seeds across large areas. This natural seed dispersal system allows resistant populations to spread rapidly. Glyphosate-resistant cachea populations have already been documented across the Great Plains. And like waterhemp, cachea often develops multiple herbicide resistances. Some populations now resist 3 or more herbicide classes. At that point, chemical control options become extremely limited. The real problem farmers now face. Each of these weeds represents a different biological strategy. Rapid growth, massive seed production, wind dispersal, multiple resistance mechanisms. Individually, each species is challenging. Together, they form a shifting ecosystem of weeds constantly adapting to management pressure. And this is where the economic reality begins to hit. Because controlling these weeds is no longer a simple glyphosate pass across the field. It now requires complex herbicide programs, multiple modes of action, more scouting, more passes, and higher costs. The system that once simplified weed control has now created a generation of weeds that require more management than ever before. Which leads to the uncomfortable question farmers are starting to ask across the Corn Belt. If glyphosate resistance continues spreading, what will weed control actually cost in the future? Because the difference between preventing resistance and fighting established superweeds is not small. It's measured in thousands of dollars across large farms. And in the next part, we're going to break down that cost. Not the theoretical cost, the real cost farmers are paying once resistant weeds take over their fields. For years, glyphosate made weed control feel almost effortless. One product, one pass, clean fields. The simplicity wasn't just convenient, it was profitable. In many operations across the Corn Belt during the early 2000s, a basic glyphosate program could control weeds for less than $20 per acre. Some operations were even lower depending on timing and generic product prices. For large farms managing thousands of acres, that simplicity translated into massive savings. Fewer herbicides, fewer passes, less fuel, less labor. The system scaled beautifully, but the economics start to collapse once resistant weeds appear. Because fighting resistant populations requires stacking multiple herbicide strategies together. Instead of relying on a single product, farmers now combine pre-emergence herbicides, post-emergence herbicides, and sometimes rescue treatments later in the season. Each step adds cost, and the difference between prevention and reaction becomes enormous. Let's look at what that means in practical terms. Scenario 1. Preventing resistance. In fields where resistance has not yet taken hold, weed control programs can still be designed proactively. A typical resistance prevention strategy often includes a strong pre-emergence herbicide program, a post-emergence tank mix with multiple modes of action, careful scouting during the growing season. That program might cost roughly $40 to $60 per acre depending on product choices. At first glance, that looks expensive compared to the old glyphosate-only system. But prevention keeps fields manageable. Weed populations stay low, seed banks remain under control, and yield potential remains protected. Scenario 2. Fighting established superweeds. Once resistant populations dominate a field, the strategy changes dramatically. Farmers now need multiple layers of defense. A typical program may include heavy pre-emergence herbicides, multiple post-emergence applications, tank mixes with 2 or 3 herbicide groups, occasional mechanical control or hand removal. Suddenly the cost jumps. Weed control expenses can easily reach $80 to $120 per acre in heavily infested fields. And that doesn't include the indirect costs. Because resistant weeds don't just increase herbicide expenses. They reduce yield loss, the hidden cost. When aggressive weeds escape control early in the season, they begin competing with crops for 3 critical resources: sunlight, water, nutrients. Even relatively small weed populations can reduce yield if they emerge during the crop's critical growth stages. For example, research has shown that uncontrolled palm or amaranth can reduce soybean yield by more than 70% in extreme cases. Even moderate infestations can cut yields by 20 to 30%. For a corn farmer expecting 200 bushels per acre, a 20% loss means losing 40 bushels per acre. At $5 corn, that's $200 per acre in lost revenue. Now combine that with increased herbicide costs. What used to be a $20 weed control program suddenly becomes a $100 program plus major yield loss. And that's the economic trap many farms are beginning to experience. Glyphosate simplified weed control so effectively that many systems became dependent on it. Once resistance appeared, the cost of rebuilding weed management systems became extremely high. The seed bank problem. Another reason resistant weeds are so expensive is the soil seed bank. When weeds produce seeds, those seeds don't all germinate the following year. Many remain dormant in the soil. Some germinate next season, some germinate years later, which means every surviving weed today can create problems for future seasons. Allow a resistant plant to produce 500,000 seeds, and you may be dealing with its descendants for a decade. That's why agronomists now emphasize something called zero-tolerance seed production. In simple terms, it means preventing weeds from producing seeds whenever possible. Because once resistant genetics enter the seed bank, eliminating them becomes incredibly difficult. And this is the real glyphosate trap. The problem was never the herbicide itself. The problem was building an entire farming system around a single solution. For years it worked. Fields stayed clean and costs stayed low. But biology never stops adapting. Every season the same herbicide is used across millions of acres. Evolution quietly selects the weeds that survive. And once those weeds dominate the field, the cost of control explodes. The farms that stay profitable aren't chasing miracle products. They build resilient systems, multiple herbicide modes of action, strong pre-emergence programs, crop rotation and cover crops. Because modern weed control isn't about one silver bullet, it's about managing the system. If you want to understand the real forces shaping modern agriculture, subscribe to the channel. This is where we break down the science, the economics, and the future of farming.